Good morning. So this is our Development and Growth 1, ECO415, and this is the 5th lecture. Today, we're going to work on the issue of structural change. So we're going to study a couple of different mechanisms. Basically, they all focus on the transfer of resource from agriculture to industry and services, and the migration of people from rural areas to urban areas. This is mostly from your textbook, section 3.3. And let's look at the outline for today. So first, we're going to look at this model developed by Arthur Lewis in late 40s, or early 50s. I'm not exactly sure at the moment. So first, we're going to look at the basic model. We're going to use a graphical approach, not the algebra approach. Then we're going to discuss some of the criticisms raised for this model. After that, we're going to discuss further issues regarding structural change. So how certain transformations occur along the economic development. Once an economy initiates its economic development process, what we observe more generally in terms of structural change. And then we're gonna conclude. So the idea of structural transformation is this. So basically, typically we look at two things. First, the composition of people, whether most of the people live in rural areas or they live in urban areas. So rural to urban migration is one particular type of structural transformation because it's about the location of where you live, right? The second part that we focus on will be the transformation of the economy from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, or to an economy where the largest share of economic GDP, economic activity takes place in industry or services. Okay? So one definition that is underlined in your textbook says that eventually the manufacturing sector, the national income share of the manufacturing sector surpasses the share of agricultural sector. Okay, so initially, suppose that you have 70% of employment, right, working in agriculture. Then at some point, the share of agriculture is 15%, but the share of industry is 30%. Then we understand that along the side of this process, this time, the economy exhibited a certain structural pattern that we associate with economic development. Okay. Now, Arthur Lewis' theory focuses on surplus labor. So, what is surplus labor? This is the this is the workforce that will be transferred from agriculture to industry. And why? Because the marginal productivity of these surplus labor is equal to 0 if they remain in agriculture. Okay. In other words, if they remain in agricultural sector, their productivity does not contribute to the economic welfare of the society. Why? Because there is this limit in the agricultural technology, and beyond that limit, we have surplus labor, and we want to transfer these people where they will be productive. Where is that? That's the industry and services. Okay, so the entire idea is that if there is that surplus labor, and if this economy is to develop, then these people should move from agriculture to industry because in agriculture, their productivity is zero, their marginal productivity is zero, but in industry and services, their marginal productivity is positive. Okay, so the idea is that. More specifically, we can discuss now, we can give a definition, the excess supply of labor over and above the quantity demanded at the going free market wage rate. So imagine a competitive agricultural sector. In that sector, depending on labor supply and labor demand, so labor demand basically originates from the firm's decisions regarding profit maximization, right? This is the stuff that you know. Then there is this market wage. Now, if at that market wage, firms leave some workers unemployed, then we can call them excess supply of labor, okay, or surplus labor. And the Lewis model, now we have, of course, two sectors, right? Agricultural sector and manufacturing sector, because we want, so there exists this surplus labor in the agricultural sector where marginal productivity is zero, and along economic development, this surplus labor will be transferred to manufacturing. So in that sense, it will be rural labor. Okay, because typically we of course observe agriculture taking place in rural areas, and that's especially true in pre-industrial societies or developing world. Okay, so what are these two sectors? So again, a traditional overpopulated rural subsistence sector. Overpopulation here is important, right? So some of these people living in rural areas in the working age years, they will not be employed because their marginal productivity is zero. And then we have high productivity or modern or urban industrial sector. Now the pace of development in this model depends on capital accumulation, obviously, okay? Because if capital accumulation in the manufacturing sector or the urban sector is fast, if it is strong, then productivity will increase in that sector, right? Labor, or even if with fixed productivity, labor demand will increase. So if you imagine, I will just show you in a moment, but if you imagine the labor market graph, so you have wage on the vertical axis and labor quantity on the horizontal axis, then if capital accumulation continues in this sector, labor demand shifts right. Okay, so that increases the quantity demanded, right? So that increased quantity demanded will absorb the surplus labor in agriculture. So that's the entire idea. Okay. So here are some assumptions. Again, first one is about the surplus labor. So if there's surplus labor in agriculture or in the traditional sector, then their productivity will be zero. Their marginal productivity will be zero. Second, in the modern sector, capitalists will reinvest all their profits. So if capitalists have profits, this profit will be transferred directly to investment. Okay. And finally, in the urban sector, wages will be constant. This is not entirely, of course, correct if you look at historical experience, but this is not a very critical assumption. So there are different versions of the model. So you can write different versions of the model where wages can increase depending on, let's say, exogenous technological progress. But in the simple model, we're going to focus on a graphical analysis. We're going to use a graphical analysis. And in that simple analysis, we're going to assume that urban wages or manufacturing wages are constant. Okay, so that's the foundation, right? So here are the details. So in that graph, you see, of course, two panels. The horizontal axes are the same. So on the horizontal axis, you see quantity of labor in agriculture, okay, QLA, quantity of labor in sector A. Sector A here is agriculture, okay? On the top panel, you see the production function. Okay, so there is this concave production function, but at some point, denoted by LA here, basically marginal productivity becomes zero, right? Look at here. So you see here average and marginal productivity of labor. And at this point, LA, marginal productivity is zero. Okay, and total production becomes constant. Okay, and there are a couple of further things. Let me zoom in a little bit. Okay, you can still see it, right, when I zoom in?
Yes.
Okay, so here we're gonna make a couple of assumptions actually. First, capital stock in agriculture is fixed. This is a simplifying assumption. And then technology here, the technology is denoted by T, little, lowercase t. It is also constant in agriculture, okay? So when this is true, then it is reasonable to assume that eventually diminishing returns kick in, right? So there is a particular quantity of labor in agriculture that equates marginal productivity to zero, okay? And then we also make a simplifying assumption. You're gonna kind of assume that everybody working in agriculture gets a share from the pie. Okay, so average product is assumed to be equal to wage. Okay, so in that particular simplified version, there is no land rent. Okay, so you may imagine that everybody working in agriculture, so they're peasants, they have the land. They work on the land, they got the product. So the total production divided by total number of people working in agriculture becomes their wage, okay? And that wage is of course WA, okay? And it's here. So let me go back to full screen. Okay. So that's what happens in agricultural sector, and of course, labor quantities larger than LA correspond to surplus labor. Okay, so up to LA, firms are happy because marginal product is positive, production is increasing. Okay, and after that point, production remains fixed, and for this reason, this is called surplus labor. Okay, so imagine that if your rural population is here, let's say on exactly on this point, then this part becomes surplus labor whose marginal productivity is zero. Okay. Now, let's look at what happens in the manufacturing sector. Okay. Now, we have, again, a production function, right? A production function. Okay. More people are coming to the waiting room. Do you generally have problems with the connection? Because some of you, I think, lose connection and reconnect again. I think some of you have unstable connections. Okay. Shall I continue? Do you hear me and see me well?
Yes.
Evet hocam, sizi duyabiliyoruz.
Okay. All right. So again, we have a production function. So on the horizontal axis, we have quantity of labor in both axes. Now, what we see here is that in manufacturing, capital accumulation will continue. Okay. And we also assume, as you remember, manufacturing wages are constant. So how can manufacturing wages remain constant when there's capital accumulation? Well, we have this supply curve that is zero slope, right? And that makes sense, right? There is surplus labor out there. So the supply of labor has basically zero slope. Okay, so you may imagine that since there is a difference, right? Let's zoom in once again. You see that there's a difference between manufacturing wage and agricultural wage. Okay, because of this difference, surplus labor will directly transfer to the manufacturing sector because they have higher earnings. If they remain in rural area, if they try to work in agriculture, they remain unemployed, they earn nothing. So if they move to the manufacturing sector, they earn a wage larger than the agricultural wage. Okay? So there's a flow of people from rural areas to urban areas or from agriculture to industry, right? Now, labor demand, of course, shifts right? This is the inverse labor demand, basically. And that depends on capital accumulation, all right? When capital accumulates, this marginal productivity curve or the inverse labor demand curve will shift right. Then what happens? Then, of course, employment in manufacturing increases, right? Employment in manufacturing increases from L1 to L2, then L2 to L3. When capital accumulation continues, wages are still constant because we are assuming that type of labor supply decision. So that's there, right? Real wage, which is equal to marginal productivity of labor in manufacturing, will remain larger than the agricultural wage because agricultural wage is there. So people are employed in the rural sector, average production becomes basically agricultural wage, and that is lower than the manufacturing wage, of course, by assumption. That's it. Once again, we're going to assume technology is fixed, but you may imagine that technology can be progressive as well. So if there's technological progress, then we're going to see larger shifts in the labor demand. And if supply becomes elastic, then we're going to see, of course, wage increases as well. So there are different modifications of this model. Okay. And that's the process of development now. Now we're going to merge these two figures. So we have 4 panels. On the right panel, top and bottom, you see the agricultural sector. On the right panel, on the left panel, top and bottom, you're going to see manufacturing sector. And here I identified 4 dots, okay? 4 points in historical time, okay? Now, initially, the equilibrium is at blue dot, okay? The equilibrium is here. So there is surplus labor, as you see, right? So the difference between red circle and blue one is the surplus labor in agriculture. How do I know that? Well, there is zero marginal productivity here for these people, okay? So on this axis, we are here. If most of the labor is in agriculture, then comparatively fewer workers are employed in manufacturing, okay? So in the manufacturing sector, quantity of labor is close to zero. Here it is close to the other end, okay? Then in time, what happens? Obviously, capital accumulation continues in the manufacturing sector, right? That's the idea. when capital accumulation continues, eventually we hit this point, right? We hit the red point where we define the surplus labor. Okay, at this point, again, marginal productivity of the surplus labor is 0 in agricultural sector, but beyond that, it will be positive. Okay, if you go left on this axis, if you go left in the horizontal axis in the agricultural sector, eventually it's gonna be positive, right? So here, of course, quantity demanded in the manufacturing sector, quantity of labor demanded in the manufacturing sector is larger, right? Because there's fixed amount of labor basically. We're gonna rule out population growth and other things. So what happens then after that point, after the red circle? Capital accumulation continues, right? When capital accumulation continues, now people will realize, okay, I have positive marginal productivity in agriculture, but wage is lower, right? Wage could be still lower than the manufacturing wage. So they could be still transferred from agriculture to manufacturing. So we arrive at the green circle. Okay? The green circle. So that process continues until when? Well, until there is an equilibrium. So in that particular graphical version, there is no such endpoint. Okay, but you may imagine that if capital accumulation continues, a larger and larger, an increasingly larger fraction of labor will be employed in manufacturing, a highly small fraction of labor is going to be employed in agriculture. So you may actually imagine, since average productivity curve defines the wage, right? Now notice one thing. If quantity of labor employed in agriculture is getting lower and lower, what happens in that sector? Well, wages increase, right? So at some point, you may imagine that agricultural wage is equal to manufacturing wage. So people would have no incentive to migrate to the urban areas, right? Because they're gonna earn the same wage. So the entire idea of development is then to absorb the surplus labor that makes agricultural wage less than manufacturing wage in the economy, okay? So this is not a policy thing. This is technology, basically, all right? This is technology and endowments. If initially your endowments, your labor endowment is largely in agriculture, that creates a surplus labor situation where marginal productivity is 0. And even if marginal productivity is not 0, look at, for instance, the green circle here, it can still be, the associated wage could still be less than the manufacturing wage. So people would have a certain incentive, a strong incentive to migrate to the urban areas and to work in the manufacturing sector because they're gonna earn more. And this is economic development according to Lewis' theory, because once capital accumulation continues in the industrial sector, then that translates into higher, basically, production, because now you are using your resources in the sector where they are productive, right? I mean, compare here the blue dot, equilibrium 0, and the green dot, equilibrium 4. Okay, between these two equilibria, of course, the green dot, equilibrium 4, is associated with higher productivity, because in the blue equilibrium, in the initial equilibrium, you are not using your resources where they are productive. You are employing them where they are unproductive, where their marginal productivity is 0. All right. So that's the entire idea. And of course, you can write different versions of this model. You can, for instance, make a 3-sector version. You can also introduce services, or you can introduce technological progress. Then actually you can introduce endogenous technological progress. So you can say that Well, technological progress is not entirely exciting, but it depends on where people work, what type of work they are doing, what type of materials they're interacting with, etc. So what is the learning technology in the economy? You may start thinking about that, and eventually you can also extend this model with technological progress, basically. Now, one thing you should also think of is this. So there is a certain sense where this model is complementary to the Hacettepe model, right? What is that sense? So here we assume that capital accumulation continues, right? The entire notion of growth in Hacettepe model, and in fact in Rostov's ideas as well, that depends on capital accumulation. So you can actually imagine both models are to be complementary. On the one side, we have Hacettepe model. In the Hacettepe model, there is a single economy, there's a single sector where capital accumulation continues because there's savings. So savings translate into investment, et cetera, et cetera. And then there is this particular model, the Lewis model, where now we have two sectors. In one sector, capital accumulation is not there. So capital is fixed. This is agricultural sector. But in the manufacturing sector, capital accumulation continues. So then you can merge these two ideas to understand what could be happening in a developing economy. So growth in capital stock in the Hacettepe model creates some implications for development, right? Because, you know, rural to urban migration is an important issue in itself, right? Because typically life is better in urban areas, which is not entirely true if you are living in Istanbul or New York City compared to Dacia or, you know, some southern village in Italy. This may not be entirely correct, and of course it depends on how do you define a better life or a worse life. But in general, so there are services associated with living in a city, right? With living in an urban environment. So certain living standards might be associated with this life. So if you assume that living in an urban area relative to living in rural areas is better for living standards of people, then capital accumulation, which is purely an economic thing, will translate into social effects, some economic development effects, and some social aspects of development that is associated with a better life or higher standards of living. So this is that thing. So traditionally, this type of a model is important for understanding certain patterns of economic development. So I have 2 minutes before this session ends. So if you have questions or comments, let's hear them, and then I can address them after the break.
Do we have a specific example who applied this model?
Yes, we have tons of real world examples. I'm gonna show you in a moment some figures from a paper, but you may imagine this. If you go, for instance, World Development Indicators, if you download the rural population share for many countries for many years, so that data starts at 1960, and there's data for a very large number of countries. You can actually see in time, in most of the countries across the world, there is a secular decreasing trend in rural population share. Okay, and then you can associate this with GDP per capita, which you know, that's exactly what I will do when I show you the figures after the break. So yes, we're gonna look at the real world issues as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so my time is around 9:40. So let's meet at 9:55, okay? Because it takes time to convert. 9:55, all right? Okay, I'm ending this right now. I'm gonna see you at 9:55.